All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to come and speak with you today. I really enjoyed Christian's presentation. So there's always good to learn the landscape of solar. And what I wanted to do over the next 15 minutes is talk a little bit about wind power, and specifically onshore wind power and offshore wind power, and some the potential role that these may play in the energy mix in PNG going forward. So the just differentiating onshore and offshore wind, the picture that you see at the bottom is a typical onshore wind installation that have become increasingly common around the world. Those turbines are anywhere from 1.5 to 4 megawatts in size, and they provide power connected to the grid. Construction is fairly straightforward. The picture that you see at the top is an offshore wind farm, and this is less common, but I believe in 10 years' time, they will be as common as onshore installations. They look the same as onshore wind, but they are very, very different. Those turbines there are anywhere between 5 to 15 megawatts each. These are what are called fixed bottom foundations, so they're installed on monopiles that are driven into the ocean floor. And the size of these projects can be anywhere from 300 megawatts up to 2 gigawatts. Even though onshore and offshore look similar in their size, scale, and particularly their complexity, they are very different creatures. So in terms of some of the trends that we've seen in wind over the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen very steady growth. Over the past 5 years, wind has added anywhere from 50 to 60 gigawatts per year. Last year was a particularly big year. It added 93 gigawatts. One of the things that's changed here is the percentage of offshore wind in that figure. So last year there was about 6 gigawatts of offshore wind that was added. That was almost entirely in Europe and in China. So whereas onshore wind has spread from developed markets into emerging markets, offshore wind is now making that leap, and that represents a huge challenge and a huge opportunity. So the reason really why wind is growing is pretty simple. It's just getting very cheap. Onshore wind in many markets around the world, developed and emerging, is one of the cheapest forms of new generation, period. So we see onshore wind projects being financed these days with a cost of electricity anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's often the cheapest form of new generation that you can get. Offshore wind is more expensive, certainly now it is. The fixed bottom projects, like the ones that I showed in the first picture, they have a price of anywhere between 7 to 12 or 13 cents per kilowatt hour, sometimes greater, sometimes less. There's a new technology that's coming along, kind of the new kid on the block, which is floating offshore, which is where you take a turbine and you put it in very deep water, so water over 60 meters deep, and you stick it on a floating foundation that's tethered to the ocean floor, and that can go into depths up to 1,000 meters. They are quite expensive now, but their costs are coming down fast as well. What I often like to say with offshore wind is we've seen this movie before. The way that onshore wind's price came down very quickly in the 2006 to 2010, the way that solar's price came down very quickly, around 2010, 2015. Offshore wind is doing the exact same thing. Its price is coming down very rapidly. So the International Finance Corporation has financed a lot of wind over the past 12 or 13 years. We have a portfolio of about $1 billion in wind. We financed now over 40 projects in over 20 countries around the world. And now this figure is out of date. We've now financed about 4.5 gigawatts of total capacity. And most of the projects that we have financed have been the first wind projects in these countries. And that's kind of what we do. We finance the first project in a country. to make it bankable to attract commercial finance. And then once the market is up and running and is de-risked, then commercial banks step in and they take over that development. So all this to say is that wind is a technology that we are extremely comfortable with. We know how to finance it. We know what we like. We definitely know what we don't like. But so far, all of our investments have been in onshore wind. I believe that in 10 years' time that we will be doing much more offshore wind and hopefully as much offshore wind as onshore wind, because again, that's the trend right now. We're seeing it move to the emerging markets and we have a role to play in financing it. I want to turn now to PNG and the particular wind resource that the country enjoys. The image that you see here is from the Global Wind Atlas, which is produced by the World Bank. And it shows, it's a high resolution mesoscale map that shows you average wind speeds at any point around the planet with a resolution of 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers. There's actually mesoscale models now that go down to 100 meters by 100 meters. So our ability to resolve wind speeds in any location is much greater now than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. So in this particular image, if you are in a location that is blue or green, then your wind is not that good. And it's unlikely that a wind farm, either onshore or offshore, will make a lot of sense. If you're in an area that is, lighter green, yellow, and orange, then you have a pretty good wind speed, and then chances are that you would have a productive wind farm if you installed it in that location. If you're in the red and purple zone, you have a screaming wind, which will, means pretty much world-class wind speeds. This is upwards of 8, 9, and even 10 meters per second. So there's a couple of things, obviously, that spring to mind as you look at this map. One is that looking at the onshore resource, as Christian had mentioned, is certainly you have an extremely good onshore resource around Port Moresby, just to the east. But then it's also spread out in various other parts throughout the country, and particularly near coastal areas, which is typical. You tend to get better winds near to the coast. The second thing that you'll notice is that PNG's offshore wind resource is an amazing attribute. You have many locations with wind speeds over 10 meters per second, and the best wind farms that are offshore wind farms that are now being built, particularly in Europe, are in about 10 meter per second winds. So you've got a tremendous resource there. So taking a look first at onshore wind and asking the question, why would you develop onshore wind in PNG? The first is obviously that you have a strong resource close to demand, but also, as Christian mentioned, you need transmission. If you've got a weak grid, it's obviously you need to be able to pipe that power from where the resource is to where that demand is. So obviously having good wind resources, being able to exploit it, is predicated on having a good transmission network. Second reason is that it's a fast response to growing power demand. Wind can be built pretty much from scratch in about 2 years, which is great when you've got the kind of escalating population growth and power demand as you have in PNG. I said it's cost competitive new generation, but there's a big caveat to that. We have learned what constitutes a bankable wind project and a transparent auction process. And if you follow these things, then you tend to get good prices. If you don't have a bankable framework, or you have got a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk, then you end up with a very expensive project. So wind's price is very much a function of how you procure it. Fourth is that it's quite reliable power. I mean, wind is variable, but it's highly predictable. And it's quite complementary to solar and hydro output. In many places in PNG, particularly around Port Moresby, the profile of wind tends to be strongest from about midnight till about 11 in the morning. So to be able to meet morning peaks, it's useful that it provides power when you need it. It's also very complementary on a longer term basis with hydro. So it's a good and important part of the energy mix. And and I think as Christian mentioned, obviously with the the Paris alignment and need for climate action, wind can be an important part of that equation. So if you look at all these things together and you say you've got a great resource and this is something that you want to develop, the next question to ask is, well, how do you scale this? I mean, how do you get onshore wind at a competitive price? As I mentioned, one of the key fundamentals is a focus on bankability. And when we as a financial institution look at financing a particular project, we look at risk. And that risk is low risk. We consider it to be bankable. High risk, it's not bankable. And either you don't get financing or it's at a very high rate. We know that you need, through our experience, you have to focus on environmental and social impacts. Wind turbines can have an impact on biodiversity. Certainly for poorly sited projects, then that can be an adverse impact. It's also important to understand its interactions with communities. As we say, all development is local, and working with local community is absolutely essential to scaling onshore wind. There's a need for open competitive auctions. We know that open tenders tend to produce the best results, international class projects with good financing and cheap prices. And part of that is attracting international players and financiers. Some of you may be aware of a model of a program that we have been running for the past 4 years called Scaling Solar. And Scaling Solar is a program whereby we engage with governments. We bring a set of bankable documents, so a power purchase agreement, government support agreement, RFP, et cetera, and we run their procurements for them. And we've had great success with this program, particularly in Africa, where we have shown that you can start pretty much from scratch using these bankable documents, starting with very low installed capacity, and be able to add new solar capacity that is international class, that is competitively priced, as long as you follow these bankable documents and this open, transparent process. And again, that's an engagement that we have with these governments. So happy to say that this is something that we are now rolling out for wind, for scaling wind, essentially using the same engagement, same process to run an open competitive tender, and using very similar bankable documents in order to get good results. So turning our attention now to kind of the new kid on the block, which is offshore wind. And so why develop offshore wind in Papua New Guinea? Well, you have an amazing resource, like really a world-class resource. We did an exercise recently where we did mapping of the offshore wind resource for countries around the world, and PNG comes out very strong, very high, a potential of 107 gigawatts of fixed foundation offshore wind, and a potential of 56 gigawatts of floating. And you can see the locations that we identified as having the best potential. Obviously, at this scale, this is not just for domestic consumption, but it might represent an interesting way of getting large scale renewables. So, but this is, as I said from the start, onshore and offshore are very different creatures. They're different in scale, they're different in complexity. So there is certainly an opportunity for cost competitive power close to demand. There's a huge opportunity for economic development. Many countries around the world that are pursuing offshore wind, one of their primary drivers is economic development. So if you go to the Netherlands and the UK and you look at their offshore wind industries, they're very much built on the idea that you can take an oil and gas sector and transition it to offshore wind using many of the same skills, because frankly, building an offshore wind farm is much more like building an oil and gas project than it is an onshore wind project, because of its scale, complexity, and the fact that it's in a marine environment. So big opportunity, but lots of challenges. You do have a higher cost than onshore, at least for the time being. And it's developing an offshore wind sector is not something that you can improvise. It requires a roadmap that brings together all of the parts that have to be in place in order for an offshore wind sector to grow. So here, what we have to offer, we have an offshore wind development program that is a partnership between IFC and ESMAP at the World Bank, and I co-lead that program with Mark Laybourne. And its goal is very simple: to accelerate offshore wind in new markets. We released recently an offshore wind development roadmap for Vietnam. We are undertaking roadmaps right now in 7 countries around the world. We develop knowledge products such as the Going Global report that you see pictured here, and then we provide support to individual countries who want to pursue offshore wind. So just a kind of wouldn't be a presentation from a financial institution if we didn't talk about what makes for a bankable project.
Sorry, Sean, just a quick note there. If you could just aim to wind up in a couple more minutes, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
And I think that there's a few, the few elements to a bankable project. Certainly, we always start with sponsors. We always need a strong regulatory framework. We need a very strong ENS assessment for both onshore and offshore. We need good technology. We need good technical capacity in the sponsor and its advisors. We need good site control, whether this is seabed or land. And finally, we need good contractors and contracts. And basically, when we are doing our due diligence on an investment, these are the pieces of the puzzle that we look to. So in conclusion, I think it's pretty safe to say that wind, both onshore and offshore, can play an important role in PNG's energy future. We believe that in the near term, the opportunity is for onshore wind. It's rapidly deployed, it's clean, it's affordable power, but there's no need to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch and do this from the ground up. You can use an approach like scaling wind that uses bankable documents and a transparent process to get really good results right out of the gate. And then in the longer term, offshore wind represents an interesting opportunity. And again, this is more for an export, for an export opportunity. And Christian had mentioned the Coral Sea Link, and certainly transmission would be a big part of being able to capitalize on that offshore wind opportunity. But the basic thing here is the need for a roadmap to look at all the pieces, the links in the chain that have to be in place in order for offshore wind to be able to grow and prosper. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. Back to you.